All right, well, sorry for technical inconvenience, but finally we got it. Thank you all for being here. And my name is Marco Schiavon. I am the assistant professor at the Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center. And well, I'll be giving you a general introduction about zoysiagrass, zoysia species, and their optimal management. Now, when we talk about zoysiagrass, and you also knew it from the questionnaire, we're not talking about one species only. As a matter of fact, we are mostly talking about two main ones, which are Zoysia japonica and Zoysia matrella. There are also some other ones that are not as important or not as prevalent. Now, Zoysiagrass as a genus is native to Asia. Name itself says it. Zoysia japonica is native to Japan. Warm, cloudy, humid climates, weather, and that actually is really quite well adapted to Florida, South Florida, and Florida in general conditions. It was introduced, the genus Zoysia was introduced in the US in 1892 from Japan, and the first report of an introduction to Florida is from 1902, so we're talking more than 100 years at this point. And the first cultivar that was brought by USDA in 1912 is Piper. There are more than 40 commercial cultivars of the genus Zoysia. Majority of them, I am listing only 21 here, and the white one are the one that you can actually find in Florida, currently in Florida, while the black one, you can find them in the US, but not specifically in Florida. Now, Zoysia japonica as a turf species, the first cultivar was Mayer. It's quite an old cultivar. You cannot really find it around here anymore. But it was the first grass that was used as turf grass for residentials. Zoysia japonica is indeed, as you actually answered correctly in the questionnaire, the best species, Zoysia species, for homeowners. And why is that? We'll talk about it. From Mayers, we actually developed quite a lot of Zoysia grasses. One of the big center of development has been California, specifically Bel Air, El Toro, De Anza. Those are all older California cultivars. Fun fact, some of these, particularly De Anza, which was bred California Riverside in Southern California, was bred to be smog resistant, to be pollution resistant, just to give you the amount of pollution that there was around LA area in the 70s and 80s. Now, Empire would be the most present, the most prevalent one here in South Florida, in homeowner setting in South Florida, but you can find also other ones, including Zenith, Jamur, Icon, and Palisades. Icon is actually not a pure japonica, is a hybrid, but we'll talk about it in a second. Zenith is the only cultivar that you can establish from seed, the only zoysiagrass cultivar that you can establish from seed. Now, we do not ever recommend to establish zoysiagrass from seed. We always recommend to establish vegetatively. And why is that? Because of zoysiagrass growth habit, which is extremely slow. That is one of the main setback of zoysiagrass, even in the state of Florida, is that it's really slow growing grass compared to anything else, especially if we compare it to St. Augustine grass, even more if we compare it to Bermuda grass. And so seeding zoysiagrass, it's basically the best way to have a nice lawn full of weeds because they will emerge and grow way faster than zoysiagrass. Unfortunately, why is this a setback? Because usually seeding is the cheapest method to establish any kind of turf grass. And when you have to sod, you usually spend around 30% more when you have to actually establish your grass. But yeah, major setback of all zoysia grasses really is growth habit, how slow they grow. The other big species is Zoysia matrella. Zoysia matrella is a finer texture zoysia compared to Zoysia japonica. Aesthetically, probably more pleasing than Zoysia japonica if you want. Zoysia japonica is coarser leaf blades, but the problem is it's mostly used on golf settings because it's resistant to some stressors. It's not as good as Zoysia japonica. So if you don't really have the resources to manage Zoysia matrella the way it's supposed to be, Zoysia japonica would be a more hardy grass, a better grass for your lawns. As for Zoysia matrella, emerald is possibly the oldest one. You can still find it. And then the majority of the cultivars that you find here, so Kashmir, Diamond, Zion, they all really use for golf or for really high-end landscapes. Now, new ones, there is a third point here, and it says new. Those are really interesting. Those are actually hybrid between Japonica and Matrella. Basically, what happened, these hybrids were created in order to have the same resistant to stressor of Japonica with the appearance of Matrella. Citrozoi is basically the only one you can find at the moment in Florida because it was bred by Dr. Ken Worthy here at University of Florida. And the other two, innovation is a really cold-resistant zoysiagrass. It was a collaboration between Kansas State and Texas. Now, if you think about Kansas winter and grasses that need to realize to survive Kansas winters, then definitely the winter hardiness of that species is really high. Lobo, on the other hand, it's actually starting being produced in Florida, I believe, but you cannot find it as much. And you can find it at Sod Solution. It was bred at North Carolina State, so condition probably more similar to Florida compared to innovation. So let me see, here it is. As I was telling you before, Zoysia japonica and macrantha, which is basically, I was telling you, icon is a hybrid. Is a hybrid between japonica and macrantha. Are coarse texture grasses. Okay, they definitely look coarser than a fine Bermuda grass, not as coarse as St. Augustine grass for sure, but still quite coarse. You can definitely see, you can definitely tell it's a warm season grass. Whether Zoysia matrella, you can clearly see the leaf blade, the width of the leaf blade is really thin. It almost looks like a cool season turf grass. The problem, as I said, is that Zoysia matrella requires completely different management and more inputs possibly compared to Japonica, and that's why we try to suggest people on landscape settings to go more with Zoysia japonica compared to Matrella. There is a third species which is called Zoysia pacifica. It's also called the Korean zoysia grass. This zoysia grass is definitely not cold tolerant, not cold resistant, and can be grown only in the central, even better southern part of the state. If you are in the panhandle, then just forget about Zoysia pacifica. And it's also quite hard to find. Now, Japonica and Macranta, El Toro, Jamur, Empire, Palisades, Icon, and Zenith are the most common one, with Empire being the prevalent in the market. Okay, number one in the market. You can find in Florida in general is Empire. Icon is the hybrid between the Japonica and Macranta, and Zenith is the only one that you can seed, but once again, we do not recommend seeding at all. The leaf texture compared to the other Zoysiagrass species is definitely coarse, not as coarse as St. Augustine grass, if that's what concerns you. The good thing about Zoysiagrass in general, even when compared to St. Augustine grass, even more when you compare it to Bahia grass, it's quite a dense grass. Why would you want to have a dense grass? Well, first of all, obviously for aesthetical appearance, it looks really good to have a denser grass. But the second thing is that usually dense grasses do not let weed come in. Basically, they choke the weed. Weeds cannot emerge. Weeds emerge, but they cannot really compete if they don't find sunlight. And density in this case is actually a really desirable trait. However, if you compare Zoysiagrass japonica to Matrella, is definitely not as dense, which also means it will require less management practices compared to Matrella. You don't really need to keep up with that density all year round. Shade tolerance is good, but not as good as St. Augustine grass. Okay, is good if we compare it to Bermuda grass, yes, 100%. But is if we compare it to St. Augustine grass, especially to dwarf St. Augustine grass cultivar, then shade tolerance is not as good. It varies among cultivars, with Jamur and Palisades having the best shade tolerance. Drought tolerance varies a lot among cultivars. Now, Zoysiagrass is a drought-tolerant grass, but in terms of watering needs, in terms of keeping it green and functional, the watering needs are really similar to those of St. Augustine grass. Okay, Zoysiagrass responds to drought by going dormant, and it can go dormant overnight. Not overnight. Well, it depends if on sunlight and temperature, but it can go into dormancy quite fast. Okay, so if you want to keep it green, you actually need to provide the same amount of water as St. Augustine grass. Always remember, dormancy is a natural state of the grass, and it's something that the grass does to protect itself. Okay. Dormant grass is not that grass. If it rains again, then Zoysiagrass is going to pop back up. But it's a grass that protects itself from drought by going dormant. Okay. Rate of establishment is slow compared to any other warm season turf grass. Zoysiagrass is really slow in establishing. The newer cultivars are faster than the older ones, but still, if you compare it to St. Augustine grass or Bermuda grass, is always going to be slow. Good salt tolerance with Icon, the hybrid having the best one. That's why you actually can find it closer to shore. Okay. And the problem, the big problem here, big limitation here is large patch response. All Zoysiagrass cultivars would be susceptible to large patch. And the problem of large patch is that basically, if you see it in the wintertime, especially down here in South Florida, where it can or cannot go dormant, you get large patch, and then you will, because of the slow growing habit, Zoysiagrass is going to show symptoms of large patch until the spring when it starts growing back. And basically you cannot, there is no fungicide that you can use as curative, okay? Mowing heights, and this is big. We always recommend to keep Zoysiagrass at around 2 inches, no more than 2 inches, okay? You can do 1.5 inches, but never surpass 2 inches. It will form a lot of touch, and it will start losing quality. Empire, as I said, most available, and it's basically the standard for Florida. And you can see it here. You can see it here in golf course settings, where it can be used as fairway or roughs, or it can be used in homeowner settings, or even in parks. It's quite really well adapted to Florida conditions, and it's really easy to find it in the market. If you're looking for Zoysiagrass, you can grow it close to water bodies. You can grow it in a front yard. How does it do under shade? It does well. It does decent under shade. You do not really want to plant it where you have shade all day long. Okay, that would probably not be your best solution. If you have mixed shades, then much better. Zoysia matrella, as we said, very fine to fine leaf texture. Okay, it almost looks like cool season turf grass, and it looks really well. It's extremely dense, really dense turf grass that keeps usually weeds out. But the problem is not as tolerant to other stressors as Japonica. Point number one, is susceptible to scalp damage, okay? Which means usually you have to mow it more frequently. And that's why that's a disadvantage for homeowner point of view. And not only you need to mow it more frequently, you also usually mow it lower, shorter. Well, then on golf settings, of course, you can mow it down to 1/2 inch. But then when you're mowing it at 1/2 inch, keep in mind you need to mow it three times per week, 2-3 times per week, depending on the season, and that's not really doable for a homeowners. In terms of shade tolerance, is actually really good. It's better than Japonica, but it's less drought tolerant than Japonica. It's going to go into dormancy as well, but then if the drought keeps prolonging, if you don't really have any water and it's not raining, you can actually start losing some turf. It's less winter hardy than Japonica. Now, these 2 points is less winter hardy, but better winter color retention. It seems counterintuitive, but winter hardiness of a warm season turf species means that grass is protecting itself against the cold. How does the grass protect itself against the cold? By going dormant, okay? So a grass that is more cold tolerant compared to a grass that is less cold tolerant is a grass that in the wintertime goes off color first. Is not a grass that retains color, okay? Because if a grass retains color in the wintertime and then you get an early frost, that grass is gone. It's not protecting itself, okay? So yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but always keep in mind when they tell you, oh, really good cold tolerance, it means that you lose color earlier in the year compared to a grass that is less cold tolerant. It has really slow establishment. For Matrella, you basically need to sod it. It would be the best way. And all cultivars are susceptible to large patch. Mowing heights, it really depends on the use you're doing on a landscape, although there are not really many landscape with Zoysia matrella. On a landscape, you can mow it around 1 inch. You can increase mowing height to 1.5 inches under shade condition. Now, the problem, try to mow it too high, it actually gets bumpy. It doesn't really look too good, especially if you're sprigging it. If you're not sodding it, you're sprigging it, you're just putting sprigs, then you will, for years, you will see where the original sprig is going to be. So try to keep it a little bit lower. There are not really a lot of Matrellas, despite their really high quality. There are not really a lot of Matrellas in wide-scale use for production in Florida. Now, Zion, which is possibly the most famous one, is the cultivar that was used in the Olympics for the first golf tournament in history in 2016, Rio 2016, and this is Zion in several different settings. You can use it for golf, and it produces a really high quality golf surface. You can 100% use it under shade. It has better shade tolerant than Japonica, or under full sun and front yard. Now, because basically we had one grass that looked really good, but it was harder to manage, and one grass that was easier to manage but didn't look so good, then plant breeders started to hybridize the two species and create a hybrid that would have good looking characteristic of one species with the tolerance of the other species. And so they created these hybrids of Matrella and Japonica. At the moment, there are three main in the market in the US, Innovation, Citrusoi, and Lobo. But yeah, in Florida, the biggest production is clearly Citrusoi because it was bred here. Now, Citrusoi is basically, if you look at the leaves, is halfway between Japonica and Matrella. So the aesthetics, the way it looks, looks more like a finer type, like a Matrella, but with less touch problem. Okay, and that's good because of tolerance to diseases and pests. The shade tolerance is better than a Japonica, but not as good as Matrella. And since it has characteristics of both species, you can basically use it for golf courses, or you can use it for homes. Innovation is a joint release between A&M and K-State, and it was bred 100% for cold. Okay. I have never seen it in Florida, so I wouldn't really know how it performs here. I have seen it in the Midwest, and I have seen it in continental climates, and it looks amazing up there. I don't really have any data to show you how it behaves down here. And Citrusoi, here it is. It was released in 2019 by University of Florida. And basically here is at front yard mowed at 2 inches and looking pretty good. Now, Citrusoi is a medium to fine texture, and always remember, for as good as a plant material you can have, if it doesn't have sod strength, meaning if you cannot harvest it and transport it, that grass is going to fail. And that's why it's really important. Compared to Empire, has better winter color retention because it's not as winter hardy. Okay, so because it has less cold tolerance, so it's going to perform well anyway. Central and northern part of the state, not a problem, but it definitely has better shade tolerance compared to Empire, and it has less incidence of large patch. This is a trial that Dr. Kenworthy run on Zoysia mode. This was more for golf, fertilized quite high. And this is actually Citrusoi, best quality in the wintertime and among the top performer, best quality, sorry, in the summertime, among the top performer of the winter. Another trial he has done comparing it to Japonicas, so comparing it to other how do you say it? To other homeowner type of settings. Citrusoi definitely came up first during the summer for the summer quality, and compared to Empire was much better during the summertime. Wintertime, then you start losing off color and things get a little bit more evened out. But yeah, here it is in other settings, much better. This picture is a backyard, not full shade again, but pretty shady conditions, and it's doing fairly well. June 2020, that was when it was done in the summertime, definitely looking better than emerald. And again, here you can see it around pools and stuff like that, looking fairly nice. So what I was telling you before, here, these pictures show you basically the different leaf blades. This is Empire, okay? You see Empire, which is coarser. Citrusoi is somewhere in between Xeon and Empire, more or less. So it looks like a Matrella, looks more or less like a Matrella, better shade tolerant than Japonica, better shade tolerant than Empire. Icon was basically bred to be a really tolerant grass, so it was not really bred for look, for appearance, for leaf blade. So, and that is why it's actually as wide as Empire or Palisades. So, just to summarize things we said, advantages of using Zoysiagrass. It's very dense turf, and very dense turf means resist weed invasion. Now, if we're talking IPM, integrated pest management, I always say your best herbicide, matter of fact, your best pesticide is a healthy, dense turfgrass stand. If your turf is happy, is going to resist pest much better than when your turf is stressed. Is when your turf is stressed, then at that point it starts thinning out, losing density, and then weeds come in, and so on and so forth. It's adapted to a quite wide range of soil, which means you can grow it anywhere in the state. There's no really limitation here. It has good shade tolerance, better than Bermuda grass, worse than St. Augustine grass, good salt tolerance, and good wear tolerance. The irrigation needs more or less, okay? If you want to keep it green, always remember that. If you want to keep it functioning, you need to water it as much as St. Augustine grass. Otherwise, it's going to go dormant. It's not dying, it's dormant, okay? Most herbicides are safe to apply, even though if we're talking IPM, the first point is much better. And we'll be talking about nitrogen now. Zoysiagrass definitely responds to nitrogen, and responds to nitrogen to more or less the same extent as St. Augustine grass. Now, Zoysiagrass needs for fertilization are lower, 100% lower than St. Augustine grass, because as soon as you fertilize it, is going to show color response, okay? So you don't need to fertilize it as much. We have been conducting quite a few studies here, and together with Dr. Anru up northern part of the state, of what would be the best nutrition, and we tried several different fertilizers and several different nutrition programs that included nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and so on and so forth. And we tested it against an untreated control, which is this one, and you can clearly see it. So no nitrogen, no happy Zoysiagrass, okay? The truth is, 2 years wrap up of the study was phosphorus not needed at all, okay? It did not improve any Zoysiagrass quality. Potassium, not really that much. The important thing was keeping it around 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year, 2 to 3, okay? And Zoysiagrass would actually look quite good, okay? Also, the other thing was urea. Urea itself, we tried urea itself, so soluble nitrogen, just urea, was not really as good as other sources of nitrogen to keep Zoysiagrass happy. So basically, our recommendations are, well, it depends where you are in the state of Florida, okay? But more or less, if you are north to central Florida, you would have to fertilize 2 to 3, 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. Do not exceed these rates because these rates will increase your amount of touch, okay? And when you increase your amount of touch, then you have pest problems, okay? And down in South Florida, you can basically fertilize all year round, and we go around 2.5 to 4.5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000. It's really important. You can stay on the low side. Depends on how your grass is doing. If you think it's doing well, there is no need to go higher, but do not exceed these guidelines. Now, keep in mind, Zoysiagrass responds better to spoon feeding, so small amount of nitrogen given more frequently. How do you do that when you have a summer fertilizer ordinance in place? You don't. Unfortunately, you can't. So try to fertilize before your fertilizer blackout starts, and try to use a slow release source of nitrogen that can last long. As a general rule, more or less, do not fertilize before April if you are in Central or North Florida, okay? South Florida can fertilize year-round. Does it mean you must fertilize year-round? No, not really, and we'll see it in a second. But Central and North Florida do not fertilize before April because chances are that Zoysiagrass is dormant, and you do not fertilize dormant grass. If you fertilize dormant grass, you're wasting your fertilizer. Grass is not able to intercept it, and you're creating perfect leaching conditions. So that means that basically your nitrogen is going to drop into the water table and pollute your fresh water resources, okay? As we said, it's best to take annual fertilizer guidelines and divide into 3 applications for North Florida. So you are more or less end of April, summer, and September before it goes dormant. To 6 application in South Florida. 6 application would mean that you can fertilize every other month, or more or less. But still do not exceed those 4.5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. If your Zoysiagrass is dormant, avoid applying fertilizer before the grass is fully green, okay? You're losing that fertilizer. You're not doing a favor to yourself, to your finances, not even to the freshwater resources. Those are our general guidelines, but keep in mind that you may live in a place where you have stricter rules, so you need to know your ordinance. Counties, municipalities, and so on and so forth have different fertilized blackout periods established, so make sure you follow guidelines of the place you're living at. As for irrigation, as I told you before, guys, Zoysiagrass responds to drought by turning brown. Okay, you do want to avoid that. Keep in mind that Zoysiagrass turns brown fast. Okay, our recommendations are always apply 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of water when the turf starts showing drought symptoms. When is that? Basically when it's starting to turn color into yellowish, brownish. The amount that you should apply does not vary, only the frequency vary. How many minutes are 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch for irrigation? I cannot tell you. You need to calibrate your irrigation system, okay? Calibrating your irrigation system is tedious and it's painful, but it's a job that needs to be done. You will need to do a catch can test, make sure that you know how much you're applying in 30 minutes of watering, 15, 30, 1 hour of watering, and then basically follow that rule. Apply half an inch to 3/4 of an inch when the turf shows sign of wilt. So these advantages of using zoysiagrass compared to regular St. Augustine grass. Is the first species that goes off color in the fall because it's the most winter hardy species that we have here in Florida. Nitrogen will not help. If it's the winter time and it's turning color, do not apply nitrogen. You can, especially down here in South Florida, extend the growth period by fertilizing before zoysiagrass goes off color. But make sure that if you do that and you can apply nitrogen to extend your growth period, make sure you know that if you have an early frost, there is a really high chance that that zoysiagrass is going to be damaged. Okay, all right. Green grass and frost are never happy. Okay, dormant grass can withstand frost. Green grass cannot. It tends to form thatch, and well, you guys will talk about it. To form about thatch and its management, and it actually is going dormant quickly without irrigation or rain. As for dormancy, the study that I showed you before, it's actually the same study, but during the winter time. Here it is. These are plots that were fertilized in November down here in South Florida at Fort Lauderdale and were able to maintain green color. This is control, and if you do not fertilize, then at that point you're gonna go definitely off color. And when it goes like this, when it goes like completely dormant, there is no point in fertilizing grass, not even in South Florida. Okay, not if the grass is dormant, please refrain yourself from fertilizing. As for thatch management, then we suggest when the thatch is too high to use vertical cutting or power raking, but always keep in mind that zoysiagrass is a slow grower, okay? So if you do these, it may take a while to recover, okay? And here it is, compare, well, we can actually skip these because I guess I'm late. Compared to other homeowner grasses, so compared to centipede and St. Augustine grass, you want to mow it depending on the cultivar between 0.25 and 2 inches with rotary type. If it's a Zoysia japonica is the only one that you can mow with rotary type, or with a real type if it's Zoysia matrella. Okay, you definitely need to use a real type. The annual fertility much lower than the St. Augustine grass, and it depends where you are in the state. As for herbicides, you have way more options compared to St. Augustine grass or centipede grass. Insects and diseases, you guys gonna talk about it, but if we look at water use, basically it's gonna use this to keep green. It's gonna use the same grass, the same amount of water as St. Augustine grass, and more water than centipede grass, 100% sure. And as for pH, it can tolerate a really wide amount of pH, so you really you shouldn't have any problem down here in Florida. With that, thank you very much. And I don't know if there's time for questions or I actually run over time.
No, you're right on. And I mean, if you're able to stick around, we'll have time allotted for Q&A for about at 3:20 or so.
All right. I'll be here.
All right. I guess we're gonna pass it on here to the yeah. Thank you, Dr. Schiavon.
Of course. Thank you.
And let's go ahead and get Dr. Dale on here next.
And let me stop sharing. There we go.
Awesome. All right, looks pretty good. Good to go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. All right. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here talking with you all. I'm glad we have such good attendance today. So Marco gave a great intro and overview of Zoysiagrass, which is great because I can't tell you anything about how to do that stuff. But what I'm going to tell you about instead is specifically Tuttle Mealybug management. And we're going to kind of walk through all aspects of this insect's biology and ecology and management in the landscape. And hopefully shed some light on some questions that you all may have. So let's get into it. So the first thing I always like to reiterate to folks is that 100% of insect plant pests are plant feeding insects, but 99% of plant feeding insects are not plant pests. So plant pests or plant feeding insects are everywhere in the landscape, but they're not typically causing problems. They're just doing their thing, feeding on plants and then being fed on by other organisms. So these plant feeding insects become pests in response to something. Typically in urban landscapes, some response to a disturbance or condition that people have caused. So I think it's really important to always consider the cause of the pest outbreak in addition to the cure. So just I hope that resonates with you, and keep that in mind as we're going through everything that I'm going to talk about here. So I'm sure many of you are aware of the handful of insect pests that do cause issues in turfgrass systems in Florida. And I'm sure many of these are familiar with you. I want to make sure you're all aware of how to learn about each of these organisms, and as you discover organisms in lawns, how to find more information out about those. So if you don't already know about it, I encourage you to use these IFAS diagnostic resources. So the IFAS diagnostic hub, this link at the very top of this slide, save that, use that as a resource. That will take you to a landing page where you can find any diagnostic information, whether those are EDIS publications or fact sheets, directories to diagnostic labs, or resources that you can buy and keep in your truck or keep at the office. That all lives at that page. So 2 documents that live at those sites are about Tuttle Mealybug and related organisms. And these are 2 documents that we're not going to go through these documents, but a lot of the information that we talk about can be found in these 2 documents. So if you don't already know about these, I encourage you to look those up and keep those as a resource. So the Tuttle Mealybug, it seems like most of you are familiar with this organism. And if you manage grass, which I imagine most of you do since you're here today, this is an insect pest that has been causing a lot of headaches in the past several years, really throughout most of the state. So it's been in Florida for quite a long time, but until the early 2000s, it didn't really start to cause issues and damage lawns to the point where we needed to keep an eye out for it and actively manage for it. But over the past several years, this thing has shown up in Zoysiagrass and Bermuda grass in most regions of the state, even up in the Panhandle. Predominantly in Central to South Florida, but it's really present throughout the state. And we're gonna go into identifying and biology of it. So everything we talk about today is going to be in the context of integrated pest management, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but really what it means is using evidence and observation to make informed decisions, and to manage the system, the landscape as a system, rather than coming in and managing the mealybug, or managing the pathogen, or managing the weed. It's a system where each of those things are interacting, and everything you do has cascading effects on other organisms. So when we're thinking about insect plant pests, we're really in integrated pest management trying to consider how our pest management inputs that are targeting those pests also influences the beneficial things in those landscapes and influence the plant and the plant health outcomes. In the context of IPM, there's kind of 3 or 5 different components that we can break it down into. And throughout the next several minutes, we're going to walk through these components in the context of Tuttle Mealybug and really try to break down how to identify it, how to look for it, how to decide when to take different actions to manage it, and then the different forms of management that should be incorporated into dealing with this pest. So first thing is identification. And so these rules, or these key components, really apply to all insect pests, but we're going to step through each of these. So 1, you got to know what your host plant is. Today it's easy because we're talking about Zoysiagrass management, but whenever you're out on a property, you need to know what the plants are that you're managing, because that's going to give you a major advantage in terms of managing pests. You need to know where the organisms are on the plant, be familiar with the different parts of the plants, what the structures and characteristics of that organism are, its mouth parts, signs and symptoms, and then how it develops and uses its habitat. So we're going to dive into each of those things and talk about those in the context of this mealybug pest. So Tuttle Mealybug is also known as the rice mealybug because it is a pest of rice and other regions of the world. It's also known to feed on all sorts of different grasses. So we consider this thing to be a real broad generalist in terms of its diet breadth. And it's an herbivore of grasses that includes several weeds. For example, like goosegrass is a host plant that it's documented to feed on. Turf grasses, obviously, ornamental grasses, sugarcane, rice, and many other species. Within Florida turfgrass systems, it has been documented as a pest of zoysia and Bermuda grass. That's not to say that it is not going to feed on St. Augustine or Bahia or paspalum or centipede grass, but zoysia and Bermuda are 99.9% of the plants that we see this thing on in turf systems. And as far as we know, there are no zoysia species or cultivars or Bermuda grass cultivars that are not hosts for this thing. So it'll feed on all of them. So when we think about where this thing is going to occur in these turf grasses, it's going to be occupying this zone kind of between the thatch, within the thatch, and at the interface between the thatch and foliage and the canopy. And so this close-up image here on the left really shows where these mealybugs are going to occur. They're going to be at the base of the leaf, oftentimes kind of tucked down in that leaf sheath at the stem. Not too dissimilar from where we would find chinch bugs, for example, in a St. Augustine grass or a zoysia grass lawn. So they're occupying that space. You're not going to see these things crawling around. You're not going to see them at porch lights. You're not going to see any real movement of these organisms. And the only way you're going to know these things are in a lawn is by digging through the lawn, collecting plant tissue, and actually inspecting and looking for it. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge, and one of the overarching reasons why this pest can get away from people so quickly is because you've really got to have your eyeballs and hands in those plants looking for this insect. And if you don't, you're not going to notice it until you see damage from it. And when you see damage from it, you've got a really high density population. So these are pink soft-bodied insects, just like mealybugs you would see on an ornamental plant in the landscape. They do have 6 legs. So an important characteristic that we're going to look at later and talk about is that these things do crawl around and they are mobile. And if you look at them very closely, you can see their legs. So I'll show you some more images here. But if you look at some of these individuals here at this image at the top of the slide, you can see their legs sticking out from their bodies, like this one right here, and this one up here in the middle top. The other thing that's very characteristic of these and other mealybugs is that they produce a lot of white wax. So they secrete these waxy structures, and that wax coats the leaf surfaces and covers their leaves. So the wax is oftentimes the most obvious thing that you can look for on the plants. And even after these bugs are dead and gone, their white waxy residues are often left behind on those leaves. So here's just a few more images of these insects showing the white waxy secretions. Also, you can see this individual here on the bottom right. You can see its legs a little more clearly and its antennae sticking off of the front of its head. So if you collect samples and inspect it for these individuals, if you have live mealybugs on these plants, you will, if you poke them or watch them for a minute, they will be crawling around and you will see some mobility from these organisms. So just like other mealybugs that you might see and be more familiar with on an ornamental plant, Tuttle Mealybug does excrete honeydew, the sticky, sugary substance, and therefore it does support the growth of black sooty mold. And so the plant tissue that gets coated in the excretions of these mealybugs will turn grayish, darkish, because there is sooty mold growth going on the inside of that infestation on the leaf surfaces. So in addition to those signs, symptoms are going to be leaf chlorosis, gradual decline and browning out of that plant material, canopy dieback, and it's oftentimes patchily distributed in a lawn. So we'll see some pictures here in a minute of that. Again, here's another close-up of an individual infested zoysia shoot. And you can kind of see how dark the plant material is in the background of this image. Again, that's going to be kind of linked to that honeydew excretion and sooty mold growth on those plant surfaces. If you combine chlorotic plant tissue with the black sooty mold, that's going to translate to grayish areas of dieback in zoysia lawns. So these two images here are very characteristic of what a Tuttle mealybug infestation looks like 100% of the time. These are severe cases. They might be like a single patch that you see this characteristic, but it always looks like this. And every lawn I've been on, you can, once you know what it looks like, you can pretty easily pick out lawns that have Tuttle mealybug infestations, because it's going to be kind of a grayish, brownish dieback throughout the lawn. And so this image here on the right just gives you another illustration of that white waxy residue and the mealybugs at the base of that leaf. And so based on what Marco was talking about a few minutes ago, I would imagine that so this zoysia is going to be one of your more broadleaf varieties. And I've got some other photos in here of the more fine leaf varieties. Both are going to be susceptible to this insect. So we've talked about what the signs and symptoms might be and some of the key characteristics of identification. But the other important pieces are understanding how this organism feeds on these plants, how it is associated with its host plant, and how it develops and uses its habitat, because that's going to tell you a lot and help you know how what kind of management strategies are going to be most effective. So we've looked at some images of these mealybugs, but here are some more high resolution magnified images of these organisms. And here again, you can see these 6 legs on this mealybug. And then we have different life stages here present. So this one here in box A is an adult. On D on the right, we have a mix of adults and nymphs. B is one of the first instar nymphs. So this is when they're first born and actively crawling around on the plant. We can see this hair-like structure coming out of the mouth of this individual, and that is its part. And so these insects have what we call piercing sucking mouth parts. And they may be a little different from what you're typically thinking about when you think of an insect with piercing sucking mouth parts. Because most of the time when we're talking about piercing sucking mouth parts, we envision this like hypodermic needle type mouth part, like on these chinch bugs or on this assassin bug in the background. They've got these big beaks that they stab into things and then extract sap from plants or the guts from a bug. And so they're still in the same category, but mealybug mouth parts are a little different from these. So again, these here on the left are southern chinch bugs, and you can see their piercing sucking mouth part tucked up under their body. When they feed on the plant, extend that out and tap into the stem. Mealybugs have more of a hair-like mouth part. It's still a piercing sucking mouth part, but this box here on the left in C really shows what that mouth part looks like. And when it's fully extended, it really is kind of like a piece of hair. And the value there is that this mouth part is incredibly flexible and can essentially navigate the interior of a plant. So once they penetrate into that leaf tissue, they can then extend that mouth part inside of the plant, navigate through that leaf tissue and find the vascular system and tap into those nutrient reserves and sap essentially from the plant. So this gives you a really visual aid in understanding what this mealybug's mouth parts look like, that it is tapping into this turf grass and looking for plant sap and feeding on those plants. It also shows that these insects are incredibly intimately associated with their host plant. They're not going to be rapidly bouncing from one leaf to the next or one yard to the next, because it's quite an investment to stick your mouth part in a leaf, fish around inside of it, and then hang out there while you sit there and feed on the sap. Okay, so that's how it feeds. It's got piercing sucking mouth parts, and it is very intimately connected into that plant's vascular system. We also need to understand how this thing develops, what kind of metamorphosis it has. And it looks like most people got this on the pre-test at the beginning of the session. But there are 2 main types. We got complete metamorphosis, like here on the left with this moth, and then incomplete or gradual metamorphosis, like over here with this grasshopper. Knowing how an organism goes through these 2 processes is really important, because it tells us how they exploit their environment. It helps us understand when and where to look for these organisms. And it tells us if some insecticides, like insect growth regulators, might be useful and when they might be useful in terms of suppressing these pest infestations. So Tuttle Mealybug goes through gradual metamorphosis, like most of you indicated. This means they have 3 life stages. So they have an egg, a nymph, and an adult life stage. More specifically, this is what that looks like for a mealybug. Mealybugs are pretty weird organisms in that the females are these mealybug looking insects, and the males actually look like an insect with wings and an antennae eyes, legs. But that's getting into the weeds a little bit here. So basically, what I want you to remember from this, and knowing that they go through gradual metamorphosis, is that no matter the life stage, they have the same mouth parts, they feed on the same host plant, they use the same habitat, and they are exposed to the same environment. And again, this is really honing in on these things are intimately connected to the environment in which they live and the host plants that they feed on. Just as to give you an analogy and maybe something that you're more familiar with, the southern chinch bug goes through the same type of development and behaves very similarly in terms of its connection to a lawn. So in this case, you have all life stages feeding on the same plant, same way, causing the same type of damage. Because of this intimate connection and limited mobility, you tend to have multiple generations of the same population cycle through the same lawn. And this leads to some issues, because if you're actively managing that lawn, those pest populations are going to be more prone to developing insecticide resistance. And as we know with southern chinch bug, we've got documented resistance to at least 5 different classes of chemistries in Florida alone. So the implications of such a sedentary, intimate lifestyle is that these organisms respond very dramatically to any kind of disturbance and any kind of local environmental condition. And when they get the opportunity, they will take advantage of that, and their populations and start to cause problems. They're also more likely to develop resistance to insecticide inputs as compared to something like odd webworms or a mole cricket or white grubs that don't use their habitats in the same way. So this is particularly important as the resistance management piece. Very briefly, there are other mealybugs that feed on turf grasses out there. So don't assume you have Tuttle mealybugs every time you find a mealybug-like insect. So this Rhodes grass mealybug is another one that we'll see on a variety of warm season grasses. It does look a bit different. So it kind of looks to me like the tip of a Q-tip stuck to the side of a turf grass stem. But to confirm your diagnosis, I encourage you to utilize the resources that IFAS has available. So the Insect ID Lab here on campus at UF, Lyle Buss is a great resource. So he could be someone you reach out to and send samples to if you do find infestations and you're unsure of the diagnosis. All right, so we've talked about identification and biology. Now we're going to talk about looking for these bugs in the landscape. Like I mentioned earlier, these things are obscure. They're hiding in the lawn. They're tucked away. They're not very mobile. So you've got to look for them if you're going to find them. But some other important things to consider are what time of year it is. Again, what's your host plant? And what has happened in that landscape in the past. If you don't have one already, I encourage you to get a hand lens or some sort of magnifier so you can really inspect these plants to detect infestations, but also, as I will reiterate again and again, to determine if your infestation is composed of live mealybugs. Are those mealybugs crawling around when you poke them? So Tuttle mealybug seasonality is a really big thing. And every year around August, bugs are starting to cause a problem because everybody's a little irritable or stressed out. And that's because that's when all the damage shows up. That doesn't mean that Tuttle mealybugs are starting to outbreak at that time. they're around all year, and they tend to build up their population throughout the spring and into the summer. But the turf can generally keep up with that activity and feeding damage until that turf starts to slow down. Day length gets shorter, temperatures cool off a little, and the damage from those mealybugs starts to really shine and become more apparent. So on this calendar, the black line is your Tuttle mealybug population size. The red line is your damage. And generally speaking, no matter where you are in the state, your peak damage is going to occur late summer, early fall. That might shift left a little or right a little, depending on where you're at in the state. But it's a pretty predictable seasonality. So looking at this figure, you don't want to begin looking for and managing for these insects in late summer, early fall, because at that point it's too late. You've got to go late spring, really late spring, and be managing for these things preventively well in advance. And that means eyeballs on the plants, and various other inputs that we're going to be talking about here in a second. So decision making is the third component of IPM. And this is really knowing what to do about an infestation and when to do something. And like I mentioned earlier with the definition of IPM, it's got to be evidence-based, observational. You have to be on the property, making notes, making observations, so you can make informed decisions. And a lot of times this decision-making question, when people come to me and ask, what do I do about this pest? Typically that's in the fall, because that's when damage has exploded. But the first question you need to be able to answer is, are there live mealybugs in that lawn? Can you find any live mealybugs? And the answer to that is going to determine a lot of times what you do. But again, they are going to be crawling. Look at this thing right here in the middle of the picture. That mealybug has legs, it's alive, it's moving around. So you got to have your eyeballs on the plants. We're going to talk about treatment here in a minute, but let's say you have treated, now what? I talk to so many people who get in this cycle of treating, coming back, not seeing a turf response, and then assuming that the insecticide didn't work, so they treat again, come back a couple weeks later, don't see a turf response, so they treat again. But in none of those instances have they closely inspected that turf and found live mealybugs. And so the number one thing you got to do is you have to be down on the ground, taking samples throughout the damaged area and looking for live mealybugs. Remember, Marco said Zoysiagrass is a slow grower. So because of that, it takes a long time to recover from damage like what you see in these photos. So you can get control of the bug, but the turf recovery is oftentimes a separate project because it needs time and it needs some TLC. So the most important thing when it comes to Tuttle mealybug management is answering the question, why did these things outbreak in the first place? Like I mentioned at the beginning, plants have plant feeding insects on them always, but they're generally at low densities where they're not causing any kind of damage. So when they do reach damaging densities, it's typically a response to one or a combination of these three factors here at the bottom. So the plant quality or defense, the presence and activity of predatory or parasitic organisms, or the ability of that insect to establish, reproduce, and survive on that plant. So we're going to talk about each of those things in the context of Tuttle mealybugs. And the underlying thing here are cultural practices. your ability to manage this plant and set it up for success are going to largely determine your ability to manage Tuttle mealybugs. And that's tough because a lot of times if you're managing the pests, you're not managing the plant. If you do manage the plants and the pests, you have an advantage by far. But at the least, you got to communicate with the folks managing the plants. So first, management of mealybug food quality and availability, and then management of mealybug habitat within the lawn and then at a larger scale within the neighborhood, for example. So food quality, insects benefit the most from consuming nitrogen. Plants are generally not a great source of nitrogen. They have a lot of carbohydrates and sugars. But when they get stressed or they get fertilized, they become a better source of nitrogen. So we know drought stress has been linked to increased densities of scale insects and mealybugs. And this includes Tuttle mealybug. And that's because when the plant gets stressed, one of its physiological responses is to release amino acids into that sap. And that provides an increased availability to nitrogen for these sap-feeding insects. We also know that increased soluble nitrogen application rates have been linked to sap-feeding pest outbreaks because you're putting more readily available nitrogen into that plant vasculature again. In terms of food availability, we know that drought stress or water stress is a very important piece of the puzzle. One thing to keep in mind is that piercing, sucking mouth parts, insects, sap-feeding insects, aren't really sucking sap out of a plant. They're tapping into that vascular system and basically opening their mouth. So if you think about a pressurized pipe or an irrigation line, if you poke a little pinhole in that line, you get a pressurized concentrated spray out of that pipe. And that's essentially what the plant's vascular system is going to be like when you tap into it, if that plant is hydrated. When we get into trouble is when plants like turf go through periods of water stress or a lack of water, and then they get rehydrated because that induces that water stress response where you get more nitrogen in the vascular system. And then it rehydrates the plant, which increases the pressure and allows those bugs to get more feeding activity in. So it's really these pulsed stress, periods of pulsed stress where you go drought to hydration, drought to hydration, that benefits bugs like mealybugs, even chinch bugs and other sap feeders. So mealybug habitat. So I wrote kind of an analogy in here. Let's say your favorite food is available everywhere around you. That's going to be a pretty good situation for you. And if you can eat that favorite food tucked away in a comfy couch, you're going to do even better. And you're not going to go anywhere. You're going to just eat your heart out. So with Tuttle mealybugs, if you have a vast, expansive Zoysiagrass lawn, where it's nothing but Zoysiagrass lawn, you have a buffet in all directions. And you have other conditions like the cultural practice, like nutrient availability, or other habitat requirements, you're going to thrive. And so the primary one is thatch. And Marco discussed thatch in good detail. So I'm not going to dwell on that. But thatch is the perfect habitat for Tuttle mealybugs. And we see time and time again, zoysia lawns with a thatch management program are less susceptible to Tuttle mealybug infestations or outbreaks. And when a lawn has a Tuttle mealybug infestation, managing that thatch, it dramatically helps suppress that mealybug population and get it under control. So thatch management is an essential piece of the puzzle for Tuttle mealybug management because it's So zoysia is prone to thatch accumulation, and that thatch provides that comfy couch for these mealybugs to eat their hearts out. So you're reducing favorable habitat, you're reducing ancillary problems like fungal pathogens because the turf's staying too wet. You're also opening up the canopy so that any resident mealybugs that are in there would get exposed and therefore controlled by insecticide applications. And that thatch is not a barrier to any of your chemical inputs. So when we think about cultural management for mealybugs, water stress followed by rehydration is a recipe for more Tuttle mealybugs. Higher soluble nitrogen rates are also a recipe for more Tuttle mealybugs because that benefits their reproductive potential. And thick thatch harbors those mealybugs, provides them a refuge to feed and not be susceptible to your pest management inputs and things that might eat them if they were more exposed. So these three cultural management pieces are really essential for managing Tuttle mealybug. So another form of management that is important to keep in mind for mealybug management is biological control. And I'm not talking about buying ladybugs and releasing them in lawns or anything like that. What I am talking about is conserving the predatory and parasitic organisms that naturally occur and already live in these lawns. And so there's two primary ways you can do that. Number one, you can have a Zoysiagrass lawn that is not as expansive, or it's more broken up and patchy. So for example, rather than having a 50% of your 1 acre lot occupied by Zoysiagrass, it could be 25%, and then the remainder of that 25% could be a diversity of other plants. So for example, we know that having various plant types in a landscape provides habitat for things that eat plant pests. So providing that habitat is going to increase the natural regulation of Tuttle mealybugs. We also know that if those neighboring plants flower and attract pollinators, those flower visiting insects are going to largely include wasps, predatory flies, and other predatory or parasitic insects that will then spill over into that maintained turf and eat Tuttle mealybugs. So that's number one, basically reducing the available food source and increasing resources for things that will then spill over to eat Tuttle mealybugs. Number two is choosing the right insecticide and using it when and how you should. So number one, that is avoiding repeat, so back-to-back broad spectrum insecticide applications to the lawn. And when I say broad spectrum, these are products that control essentially any insect or arthropod that they come into contact with. They are not selecting for your target pest. So avoiding making back-to-back applications of those products will it'll conserve the spiders, the beetles, the ants that are naturally living in that lawn eating mealybugs. So related to that, we know systemic insecticides, translaminar insecticides get inside the plant and therefore reduce exposure to the predatory things that aren't feeding on the plant, but they are crawling around on that plant surface. So for example, we know we've done several trials where we test different insecticides, the contact toxic broad spectrum products compared to systemic selective products. And we see that, for example, when the predators walk across treated leaf tissue, one day and 1 week after that product was applied, 100% and 50% of those individuals die simply from walking over that leaf tissue, not feeding on it, just walking on it. So if you extrapolate that to an entire lawn, that's going to have a dramatic effect on that resident predator population. And if you remove all those predators from that lawn, you are opening the window of opportunity for the mealybugs to eat and feed in the absence of things that want to eat them. So this gets me to another one of these IFAS resources that I encourage you to use. I hope this can be a good, useful resource for you. So this is all about insecticide selection, modes of action, resistance management, and it goes into a lot of detail about different active ingredients, how they work, what types of pests they control, and so on. So hopefully that can be a good resource. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the information that's in here. One thing I want you to remember and keep in mind is what the difference between a curative scenario and a preventive scenario is. Also, what's the difference between a curative insecticide and a preventative insecticide? In short, curative products rapidly knock down a pest population, and they generally work on contact and are broad spectrum. Preventive insecticides provide plant protection before there's a problem. And these are most of the time, they're systemic and or translaminar, but not always. They can also be contact toxic. However, these preventive products are always selective. So they work on a relatively narrow range of target pests. So these are just some example tables of products available to the L&O world. So I'm going to show you an example of contact toxic, translaminar, and systemic products. So contact toxic products rely on coming into direct contact with the pest, either sprayed on the pest or when that pest walks across a surface that product was sprayed on. These are only foliar applications and really require thorough coverage, where oftentimes adding a surfactant or a spreader sticker will help. One important thing here is that contact toxic does not always mean broad spectrum. So products like acephate or carbaryl or bifenthrin, if those are applied as a foliar application to a plant, they are going to be broad spectrum. They're going to control everything that they touch. Other contact toxic products like novaluron, for example, or buprofizin, these are going to interfere with how a plant feeding insect develops and molts from one life stage to the next. So they are more selective for those plant feeders that you're trying to target. When I say a translaminar insecticide, I mean this thing moves into the plant tissue and it remains in that plant tissue where it's then ingested by the organisms. And then when I say systemic insecticides, I mean these products move throughout the plant and are expressed in all parts of that plant where they can then be ingested. So systemic and translaminar products are going to be the most selective of your options in terms of your synthetic chemistries. For the turfgrass industry, I do want to make one product, bring that up on your radar, because we do have so few chemistries and so few chemical classes available for turfgrass applications in residential lawns. This is a completely different insecticide class, a group 15, and it works well against some sap feeding insects. So I would consider evaluating this in your programs and seeing how you might be able to build it into your programs. So in terms of a program for Tuttle Mealybug, you got to consider whether or not you're in a curative or a preventive situation with your infestation. You need to know you have live mealybugs. You got to look for the bugs, scout for those, keep an eye on it, and then determine, do you have a problem? or are you catching things before there is a problem? And those situations are going to dictate what products are going to be most appropriate and make the most sense. If you've got a problem, then it probably makes sense to use a broad spectrum contact toxic material like a pyrethroid first. Whereas if you're catching things preventively, then incorporating something like a growth regulator or a neonicotinoid are going to be more selective and preventive and allow these other IPM tactics to work with you. It's also important to use a sufficient spray volume, and if you are making applications to things with contact toxic products, using some sort of spreader sticker will increase that spread on the leaf tissue. I want to emphasize that if you are reliant on insecticides to control Tuttle Mealybug, then you will remain reliant on insecticides to control Tuttle Mealybug, because these organisms really require an integrated approach where you can manage different aspects of lawns in addition to the chemical inputs. I would absolutely rotate chemical classes, because these things are going through multiple generations in the same lawn because they're not very mobile. So resistance has not been confirmed, but it is something that I would be cautious of, because it's likely to occur. And yeah, make them only when you need to make those applications. So my last slide, some closing points and closing thoughts. Tuttle mealybugs are problematic pests because of the conditions that we create and the stage that we set. You can't spray your way out of the problem. You've got to incorporate cultural management practices, and you've got to use insecticides strategically and appropriately. And once you have an infestation, insecticides are really the only way to reset that population. You got to scout and monitor by looking at that plant material very closely. And then patience is essential. Don't get into this cycle of reapplying insecticides because the turf hasn't responded. Make sure you control the bug and then promote turf recovery separate from controlling the bug. And it does take time, several weeks to months, depending on the severity of that damage. So with that, I am happy to take questions after the next little session. Here's my contact information, my lab's webpage where you can find more of our resources. And again, I encourage you to use our diagnostic resources available through IFAS and through our department. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Dr. Dale. That was, I mean, that was all the resources we could have asked there or what I've been, I guess it answers a lot of the questions that I tend to get here pretty regularly. And I guess going into like the more extension-y side of this, which is like what people are doing in the landscape. Yeah, there's still a lot of questions that we encounter, and I guess we're I think that like you'll probably get some interesting questions here towards the end here as well. So but with that, I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen. Is that coming in okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay.
And it's not in the presentation view yet.
It's not in presentation view.
We just see like your PowerPoint slides.
Let's try this again. Is it in presentation mode yet, or?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. So I'm gonna largely just kind of riff off of a lot of the points that Dr. Schiavon and Dr. Dale brought up here. I mean, we're the ones that are kind of on the ground here locally, here in South Florida, and we kind of deal with the landscapers somewhat regularly, the folks that will be the front lines to managing this issue. And so, yeah, I've got with me here, I got Kara Kruger from Palm Beach County and Henry Meyer from Miami-Dade. And so we're kind of on the front lines of dealing with this here. And the big thing, you know, like we deal with an extension, I guess, is kind of like the human side and like managing people's expectations and like trying to offer up the best science. And that gets to like understanding like the psychology behind the problems that we have as well. And I guess what I try to emphasize here is why Zoysiagrass? Why do we like Zoysiagrass? And I think that what stands out about it in particular is that it has a pretty good texture. It actually is kind of pleasant to walk on and actually enjoy yourself in, as opposed to like the St. Augustine cultivars that are out there. They tend to have a very wide blade. This is the closest we can get to what a lot of the northern grasses offer in terms of suitability for recreational activity. I mean, you can't get that with Bermuda and stuff, but like it's got its own management issues and tends to be confined more towards like athletic fields and that type of thing. This strikes the balance that a lot of people, particularly people coming from up north, want for their yards. And they really like the leaf blade texture. So this is a site here that is about to be harvested for sod. We've got a lot of this that goes on in Palm Beach County and Martin County. And here's what it looks like after it's being harvested. I think that this is in particular, this is Empire, but the most commonly utilized in the landscape currently. But yeah, we want to highlight too that there's innovations going on out there. Citrusoi is the new hotness, so to speak. So it should be interesting to see how this one performs here as it gets more widespread usage. And I know that there was some talk about that all of these are susceptible to being infested by Tuttle Mealybug. But I am curious if some of them have different levels of susceptibility and what is known about it, because I kind of have some ideas off of anecdotally what I've heard from people, but it's a pretty low sample size. So I'm curious what Dr. Dale might be able to elaborate on, or if there's anything that's known. So yeah, we've got all these different ways to get the turf. There's different cultivars, but you know, step one for a lot of IPM approaches is just the scouting. So specifically for Tuttle Mealybug, and Dr. Dale kind of he did a pretty good overview of talking about how seasonality impacts the biology of this specific pest. Visually, symptoms on the turf and monocultures appear like problems with drought, but they're often patchy in appearance. Search around the edges in particular, like that's usually, it's the same deal with chinch bugs in St. Augustine. Places where it's transitioning from impacted and unhealthy looking grass or even dead grass to the healthy spots, that's usually where your hot zone, where you're going to be able to pick up on more activity. For this particular pest, cooler, wet weather is less problematic for us, whereas dry or hot weather, that's when you will encounter more of the problems. So the heat isn't necessarily an issue on on its own, but like particularly when it's dry, it's really going to start showing up. And that also lines up with the amount of pest pressure that's out there as well. Site history, be aware of that. I mean, if it's been on the site, it's likely to be encountering problems in the future as well. And then Empire kind of seems to be the most susceptible, but that's also the most widely used cultivar as well. So here's a site that's impacted. You can see here it's just showing up kind of like drought. I think this is an irrigated site. So if you're encountering folks that are saying that their sites are irrigated and they're having these drought-like symptoms, and in particular, if you get the patchiness that's occurring on top of that, it's probably time to scout and see if you can find any signs of this particular pest. But here's just some more pictures just to give you things that aren't going to show up necessarily as well in the PowerPoint as in person and vice versa. But yeah, I'm just trying to show here that you can see these kind of brown patchy spots compared to like other areas that are really green and more robust looking. Here's a really, really good example of a site that it's really large, almost the size of a football field, where planted in zoysia, where we were able to find Tuttle Mealybug. You can see here's Kara actually like going through and scouting on this particular site, but really dead spot right there. So yeah, as Dr. Dale mentioned, you got to look really close to the bottom portions of the living parts of the turf, and particularly like the unions between like the more stemmy parts with the leaves. That's where you're going to be finding evidence of the Tuttle Mealybug. And as you can see, sometimes you won't find them by themselves in the beginning. Sometimes you'll just find that waxy, resinous type white cotton candy like substance. But that's all of this is are things to look to if you suspect the site. But yeah, usually you could find them tucked away like in those unions. And so with that, I'm going to kind of cover two aspects of management here, because a big part of what we deal with here is just not just managing the biology and the environment, like with these pests for this specific example, but like it's also for the clientele. And I mean, this goes back to culture. It goes back to, I mean, I guess economy, because there's a lot of money involved with this. So there's a lot of things that play into like how we process these issues. And as landscapers, it's your job, the people that have landscape companies, is that there's always going to be a customer involved, and the customer is always right. The customer always, people kind of forget this sometimes, the customer is always right in matters of taste. And in this circumstance, like they've chosen the Zoysiagrass as their grass. So I guess you could back up if you wanted to and say, well, where did the problem really begin? It kind of began when they planted this big monoculture. That monocultures are very difficult to manage. And this isn't just for us in urban areas, but agriculture in general. You're going to have pest problems, and pest problems can often be costly to deal with. So you could say, well, this is what they wanted. They're the ones that kind of brought this pest, or like in this issue onto them. And maybe that is kind of a problem for us, is trying to communicate anything is going to have that you plant in large monocultures, there's going to be biological problems. And people kind of overlook some of those problems a lot of times because they see really nice yards planted in this thing that reminds them of something from up north that they had. And they want an alternative to St. Augustine, for example. Well, this thing has its own problems too. Nothing is foolproof, and it's got its own issue, but that's where you come in line, is you are the solution for that problem. So that's how they're going to view this situation. But with that said, it's up to you to communicate realistic expectations, because engineered solutions to biological problems are not impossible, but they are costly and they're far from foolproof. And grass monocultures, they're extremely intensive environments to maintain for aesthetics. So this kind of reminds me of like a Jurassic Park situation. We think that we can control everything, but there's a lot of variables to control, and there's going to be chaos. And unfortunately, in this case, it's the Tuttle Mealybug, and we run into it every year. So this is the big issue. And for landscapers, what can you do, like in terms of communication? So here's just a few talking points. Just keep in mind that Florida is a difficult place to maintain aesthetically, especially if you want perfection or something that's at least ideal. There's going to be a price associated with it, because it's just unrealistic that we have to keep this green aesthetic going all year long. It's very difficult, and people kind of forget that sometimes, that it can be that there are going to be prices attached to that. Landscapers aren't doing the same thing in other places in the country that we are. We're having to manage these problems year round. If the customer can't accept certain treatments, and in particular thatch removal, because that's something that comes up time and time again, is that a lot of people do not want to have that damaged look for a short term. They have to be able to accept that, like, they're going to have probably problems with this, other types of aesthetic problems that might last longer, and that you should probably pose the situation to them in order to avoid a long-term browning that could last months. Hopefully, we have a solution that might be able to look not great over a couple weeks or so to a month, but that involves dethatching the turf. And so the big workaround here maybe is to try and sell it as a point where there's probably going to be less people around. It coincides with when people start moving back up, the best time up north a lot of the time, and these communities that have a lot of demands for high aesthetic demands, is to go ahead and do removal during the seasonal absence of like a lot of the people that live there. So here is a disclaimer before I give you the actual bits that I have to offer that are going to touch on a lot of what the previous presenters presented on, but like I've got a little bit of local knowledge here too, but it's going to be a little anecdotal. Your mileage may vary. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. So, and this is just based off of what I've talked to folks. I'm not a turf person. I'm not a entomology person, but we're growing in these departments all the time. My big background is with trees, but we do talk to landscapers quite a bit. And verticutting and thatch removal, this seems to be like something that's very critical to get like pretty good aesthetic control over the problem with Tuttle Mealybug. Timing of insecticide application is also highly influential on the outcome. So you go back to that, if you can recall that slide from Dr. Dale, when those population numbers are peaking, or in building towards peak, that's probably going to be the best time. So June, July, probably June, I think, is generally a good time. May maybe as well. A good systemic application leading up to hotter months is key. So, and then just for example here, Lucian, that's something that I've heard people get pretty good results from in terms of controlling this. Increasing the volume of is also something that is worked in some cases of the carrier. So this is something, all you're doing in this case is you're increasing the surface area in theory of the application. So that's a big problem, is when you're not getting contact, when you're not, and potentially if they're not able to, the plant is not able to soak up that systemic, that's when you're going to run into issues. And so this might be kind of what's going on there, particularly if you're, for some of these products that might have some contact product with them. And then also just in general, if you're worried about aesthetics all throughout the year and like the overall health of the plant, a well-timed systemic fungicide can also do a lot of good for them if you're worried about disease during the winter, because they are pretty susceptible to some of the fungal diseases we get during the colder parts of the year. So just some big picture takeaways. Always consider right plant, right place. Like, is it the right plant in the right circumstance? If you're putting it in, make sure to communicate that with people that are requesting that it be put in. They need to know what they're getting into in many ways. And then work on communicating the challenges of Zoysiagrass and Tuttle Mealybug management to your clients. I mean, that's really, it's not easy, but I mean, these things can be massaged somewhat in terms of how you present them and how you get your clientele to understand the issues. And at least the problem isn't lethal. There are a lot of things out there that are worse. And particularly in South Florida, we've got lethal viral necrosis impacting St. Augustine grass. That flat out kills the turf. And then you're in need of having to replace it. It's much more costly to do a full replacement than a lot of the treatments that are out there for this problem that's just largely aesthetic. And, you know, some people might even be able to deal with that aesthetic for certain parts of the year, if depending on like their matters of taste. So timing of thatch removal and systemic insecticides is key. So just try and line up everything with the biology that was presented here of in the environment. Those are going to be the keys to managing this pest and actually getting control for like acceptable levels of aesthetics. Here's our contacts, and special thanks to Chris Williams from Total Property Control, Anthony Henline from ANCO. They're really key in terms of giving us some of the insights that for looking into this pest. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I guess open it up to Q&A here. If you've got questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'll try and pass these along to the Dr. Dale and Dr. Schiavon here. Okay, I'm not seeing anything pop up here. So I've got a question based off of what, okay, we've got one popping up here. Will compacted soil also influence? And I guess what they're saying is just the influence, maybe the susceptibility to Tuttle Mealybug?
I would say yes. So one of the hardest things we see in a lot of turfgrass situations is new developments. And most new developments have terrible, really compacted soils. We haven't done any tests to see how compaction influences Tuttle Mealybug susceptibility specifically. But we do know that compaction will influence like water stress because of reduced water availability, and therefore would probably increase susceptibility to Tuttle Mealybug.
So probably almost any stressor isn't going to be good for the most part. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Do we have a good idea of the number of generations per year we could expect to see annually in South Florida?
That's a great question. No. In short, no, we do not know. It's multiple, but we have not done the work to quantify that specifically.
Yet another
I would
one. Oh, yes.
I would say it's not too dissimilar to like southern chinch bugs. Probably not quite as many generations. They go through up to 8 down there. But it's multiple per year.
Let's see. Are insect parasitic nematodes effective if applied in late afternoon or evening?
That's an interesting idea. I'm not aware of any tests that have evaluated insect parasitic nematodes against Tuttle Mealybug. Could be worth exploring. And I'd love to, I think, I'd love to hear if you wind up doing that or want to chat about that in more detail.
How
If I could,
often? Oh,
if I could chime in real quick, so I have a situation for a lawn in Delray, and I think John, you and I spoke about this several months ago, where we actually found out that I had a nematode issue along with Tuttle Mealybug, and they actually went hand in hand to the point where I actually got rid of the Tuttle. However, my nematodes came in so hard, so fast, and of course, it does back up to a golf course. So just from my own experience, I've noticed that nematodes and Tuttle on the last 2 properties just this year alone, I've noticed it's made a I'm not sure about a comeback, but I've noticed nematodes this year for the first time ever in the zoysia yards I've been maintaining for the last 5 years.
Okay. Well, have you, either of you, Dr. Schiavon, Dr. Dale, any experience with the I guess the nematode issues specific to the zoysia?
I haven't seen anything in relation to Tuttle Mealybug. I mean, it makes sense that if the turf had a lot of nematode issues, I'm assuming it was sting nematode, but any nematode issues, it would also have a increased susceptibility to Tuttle Mealybug. But I'm not aware of any other work or instances where those have gone hand in hand. But yeah, that is an interesting observation.
Okay, thank you guys.
How often do you recommend verticutting and dethatching an established zoysia grass?
I would say if needed, so if you know that thatch is there, once a year, springtime, the right after green up. That's when the growth is fast. So yeah, if you know you have a thatch problem, I would say once a year, right after spring green up.
I got a question. I guess this is maybe for Dr. Dale. Do you have any classes on grub worms? Maybe something that's like in a similar vein to this webinar?
Sorry, I'm trying to rack my brain. Not that I am aware of in the near future. We do classes throughout the year that touch on white grubs and caterpillar pests. So I'd be happy to, if you want to send me an email, whoever that was, you can follow up with me and I can direct you to some future stuff.
Yeah, if anybody that's still like along here with us, if you've got any questions along lines of programming, classes, webinars, on any given topics, we'll just reach out to your local people too, and we'll try and connect you. Or if we get enough requests, we'll have another webinar like for the specific topic. There's another one. I guess this is for Dr. Dale. Do environmental conditions, time of day, temperature, et cetera, have an effect on the insecticide efficacy?
That's a good question. So I would say there may be an effect. So with some insects, like some of the more mobile insects, like mole crickets or chinch bugs or caterpillar pests, their activity is very influenced by the time of day, and therefore timing your insecticide applications by the time of day can make a big difference. Since the Tuttle mealybugs are so immobile, that's not going to be as big of a factor. I think probably the most important factor is going to be things that are influencing the photosynthetic activity of the plant, and any kind of like environmental degradation of a product that you put out. So, for example, if you put out a product that breaks down in UV light more readily, then you might avoid doing it in a very hot, dry, sunny time. And also making sure the turf is hydrated and it is somewhat sunny can also be good, to be sure that the mealybugs are actively ingesting plant sap. So, like I mentioned earlier, they're not really sucking anything out of the plant. They're relying on that plant's natural movement of water through it. So when the leaves are more actively photosynthesizing, those mealybugs are more actively feeding. And so if you put an insecticide out that gets into the plant tissue, then they're going to ingest it a little more readily. So hopefully that answered your question. That was kind of a convoluted answer.
I think that makes sense. Like, I mean, basically, yeah, it's transpiration driven. So like, I guess like,
yeah.
So, okay. I've got a question here for Dr. Schiavon. What are some of the, I mean, you've got a really good pulse here in like turf developments here in South Florida, and Citrusoi seems to be pretty cool in terms of something new that's coming out and might have an impact in terms of what yards in other places look in the next 10, 20 years. Are there any other, this is kind of big picture, but like, are there any other interesting developments that are going on, like with regards to new cultivar species or technology that might really play an impact here?
Yes, there's a lot going on. Well, first of all, we're trying to see to avoid monocultural stand, we're not working only on turf. We're also trying to see what combination of mixture between turf and legumes and whatnot could work. Said that, and I speak at least from direct experience and from my backyard, I don't think that there's really any turf yard in Florida which is a monostand, a monoculture. Most of them is turf and weeds, and as long as the final the final customer is happy with it, then there's nothing wrong with it. In my yard, only in the front yard, there's probably at least 50 species other than St. Augustine grass. But yes, so we're working on that a lot, and then there's quite a lot of new St. Augustine grass coming out. One which looks really good, but I don't really have any data on Florida. It's called Cobalt and comes from Texas A&M, and that may be quite good. Yeah. Other than that, the new Zoysia, the hybrids, they look like have more potential. At least they should be easier to manage than Matrella, than the fine leaf fescue. But they should have a better resistance to stressors.
Cool. So yeah, more things in the pipeline.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, well, yeah, I guess maybe one last question here. Is Citrusoi commercially available
Oh yeah,
yet?
yeah. It's been commercially available since right before the pandemic. So maybe it's harder to find, but yeah, it's commercially available at the moment.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up Q&A here. That's lining up with our original timeline. I'll go ahead and I'm going to launch the post poll or the post test here for those of you that are still with us. If you want CEUs, they will be available via like a survey that should pop up when you exit out of the Eventbrite here. And then if that doesn't pop up, like you need to go ahead and email us as well. We will be sending you out everyone that registered and it was part of via Zoom. We've got your emails, so we will email you a link of the recording of this webinar, and so from there, like you should have had us email you already. But if you're not able to get the survey to pop up, please email me or one of the other extension agents, and we'll take care of that for you. So with that, I'm trying to find our poll. Okay. And I'm launching the post one. I think it should have popped up. Yeah, it's going right now. And so I imagine like most people are probably going to leave after they're done with their poll. So I just wanted to, at this moment, while you're filling everything out here, also thank Dr. Schiavon and Dr. Dale for being available and sharing their time. I know it's a very demanding time-wise career that you're both on, and hopefully maybe we can do this again, like in another year, maybe do this annually, because it's just good to get that information out there. So thank you, both of you.
You're welcome.
Yep, thank you.
All right, amending the poll. It looks like everybody got an A. I think we're like in the 90 percentile for most of the stuff on here, so. But hopefully I can access this again, download results. Okay. I'll get the results on Zoom afterward, but all right, well, everybody else is still here. Thanks again for spending your afternoon with us. We had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed getting access to that information, and it's good reinforcement every time as well. And we've got a couple of more webinars coming up in the near future. We've got Phantasmascale, and we've got a ficus whitefly webinar coming up within the next 2 months. So check your emails. We'll have details for those coming to you hopefully pretty soon as well. So, but everybody else, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you again, and look forward to seeing you more down in the future here.
Thank you, guys.